Hello, good afternoon. Welcome. Every field has a few seminal scholars whose research changes the way we understand what we do. Sondra Perl, in composition and rhetoric, is one of those scholars. In the 1970s, a wave of new black, brown, immigrant, and working class students came into American colleges for the first time. Many educators felt that those students did not have complex, sophisticated thinking and writing processes, and so they made a bunch of writing courses for them that focused on grammar and sentence correctness. Sondra was then a young teacher at Hostos Community College in the Bronx. She studied the writing processes of her actual students, and she found very quickly that they had rich, sophisticated writing and thinking processes and were capable of doing deep, sophisticated work. That changed our field, and that work remains foundational for us 4 decades later. Every field also has a handful of brilliant, inspirational teachers. Again, one of those very few inspirational teachers for us is Sondra. Her work always begins, her teaching always begins with respecting students' ideas and their voices. She always builds on strengths. She always inspires us, her students, and encourages and challenges us to do work that's better and deeper than we even thought we could do. Last year, she received the highest award that our field gives, the Exemplar Award by the NCTE, as a recognition of the fact that she's both an exemplar of scholarship and teaching in our field. Her 2005 book, On Austrian Soil, defies placement into any one genre. It is a deeply painful, probing personal narrative. It is a teacher research case study into a master's class on writing among teachers from across very different cultures. It is, as all Sondra's work is, an excellent example of the very finest standards for teaching pedagogy, and it is a powerful argument for tolerance and forgiveness. And so on this dreary, rainy day, I am so excited to tell that Sondra, who warns that she's not going to talk that long, she's going to show a short movie, there'll be plenty of time for conversation. I'm so excited that she's here to share with us her journey on Austrian soil. Sondra Perl.
That was beautiful. Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay. So yes, thank you all for coming on this dreary, cold, rainy day where you might want to stay somewhere else inside and warm, but thank you very much for coming. It's always a pleasure to be able to talk about work that one loves and work that one has devoted a lifetime to and feels passionate about, but it is particularly wonderful to be here at this institution because of my relationships to so many people in the English department. So I first want to thank, and the people I'm going to talk to were all at one time or another in my class as graduate students at the CUNY Graduate Center. So to have this small community now of people that used to sit in other kinds of gatherings and write together and laugh together and think together, it's amazing that this now is a place where you can invite me to come back into your universes. So I first want to thank both Ian Marshall and Sean Malloy for inviting me and making this possible, making it happen, and I just really thank them. And then I want to shout out both to David Borkowski, who was probably one of the first students in our program, and whose work I followed for many years, and very closely on David's heels, Leo Parascandola, who's also was an amazing member of our community in New York. And we all think back to, when you start something fresh and new, it's the people who are there with you, that opened the program and argued for it and thought about it, that give it its foundation. And so I'm really grateful to all of you, and thank you for this invitation. My presentation, as Sean said, will be short, and there'll be a lot of time to just get into any of the things that I raise and anything you want to talk about. It really is, hopefully will be a dialogue among all of us. But it has several parts. I first want to talk about composing, and specifically what it means for writers to face what I'm calling their dragons. And I take that term from a writer of fiction named Sue Miller, and I'll say a tiny bit more about her later, but that's her phrase, and I've borrowed it. Because what it means is we're talking about turning toward whatever discomfort we are experiencing when we're writing, rather than turning away from it. I will then read a poem from the first chapter of On Austrian Soil, which is, as Sean said, is a memoir I wrote about working with teachers in Austria. And while there, having to face my dangers, or having to face my dragons as I walked and worked on that land. And then I'll end by showing a digital story I made based on my experiences in Austria, and it indicates a little bit about where this work has led in the current world today. One of the central challenges I describe in the book has to do with how I, as the daughter of Jewish people living safely and assimilated lives in America, came to terms with working and living among and teaching the children of Nazis, and what it took for those of us in the second generation after the Holocaust to engage in what I then called post-Holocaust dialogue. This was not the agenda with which I went to Austria. So I was invited to teach in Austria a long time ago, 1996, to work with Austrian teachers of English who were receiving a master's degree from City College. So instead of the teachers coming to City College to do work here, CUNY sent the faculty over to Austria to work with the teachers in sort of 2 to 3 week intensive blocks. So my first block with these teachers was in July of 1996, and that's how I got there. But my job there was not to talk about history. I'm not a historian. My job was to teach the teachers about the latest theories of the teaching of writing and the teaching of literature that were current in the United States in 1996. And all of the teachers spoke English well enough to be in this program. So they were all teachers of English. They wanted to know what's happening in the United States. You know, how do you teach writing? Which was very different from what they had been taught. So all of our conversations, all of our writing was conducted in English. So this should have been a simple task. It was what I had been doing for most of my professional life, working with students, graduate students, teachers in many different areas, doing workshops on the teaching of writing, and I know how to do this. So it should have been simple. What made it complicated, of course, was the location. So I was brought up to believe that as a Jewish person, I should not travel to Germany, nor should I ever buy German products, and that if the circumstances were right, the Holocaust could happen again. And this wasn't impressed upon me every day, but you could, when I was growing up, you could hear murmurs about this at family gatherings or at a holiday. And when I was a child, I was born after World War II, but as I was growing up, if the subject of Germany came up, everybody would get very quiet, or there would be kind of an unease in the world. And I didn't know why until years later I began to see pictures of the Holocaust and pictures of people in, you know, their concentration camp victims wearing those striped uniforms, people emaciated, people, you know, and I used to think to myself when I was a kid, well, what would have happened if I were born there? Would I didn't do anything wrong, but would I be sent to a concentration camp? Would my family be exterminated at Auschwitz? So those were the ideas I had growing up, and they stayed with me. And when I ultimately understood the genocide of Jewish people and other people during the Holocaust and during World War II, I felt I was justified that the sophisticated culture of the Germans, you know, ended up perpetrating this enormous genocide. And so I felt somehow I should hold it. That was, you had to be strong and you had to resist, you know, you couldn't just say, well, that's easy. You know, they didn't mean it. You know, 6 million people, 1.5 million children were exterminated. So that's where that came from. So I'll say, in other words, I grew up with the belief that Austrians, and by extension, the Germans, and by extension Austrians, who were also spoke German language, and also you may or may not, Hitler was born in Austria, so for me they're very closely linked. They should be and would remain my lifelong enemies. My book explores how I came to grips with what I call inherited hatred, a prejudice that was passed on to me from my parents and that I embraced for much of my adult life. It's uncomfortable to admit to having carried a lifelong prejudice, but to get beyond it, I needed to turn toward it and then explore, again, what Susan Miller calls facing your own dragon. Today, I want to focus on the discomforts of this journey. I experienced discomfort in the classroom when I first met the teachers. In fact, I'm going to say I actually experienced it when I literally landed at the airport. I mean, I got off this plane, and this course was in Innsbruck. And you'll see in the video how beautiful Innsbruck is. You land there and you're surrounded by snow-capped mountains. It is extraordinarily beautiful. Even in the summer, the mountains have snow on them. And I stepped off the plane and I felt this chill go through my body. It was like, all of a sudden I realized I'm in the home where, had I been here 60 or 65 or 70 years earlier, I wouldn't just be welcomed. So I felt discomfort when I got to the airport. I experienced discomfort when I walked along the streets of Innsbruck and I'd see an old person with gray hair and I'd think, what did they do in the war? Were they a Nazi? I mean, it just pervaded my consciousness. I experienced discomfort in the classroom because I looked out at my students, people I normally welcome and love, and had to wonder, what were they taught by their parents? What did they think of Jews? And I could not initially even utter the word Jew or Holocaust. It felt, that's not my job. And of course, what I imagined as I walked through the streets were the scenes I had seen in photographs. Jewish people forced to crawl on their knees and clean the sidewalks in Vienna with toothbrushes. The word Juda scrawled on a storefront windows so that people were told to boycott the stores. The Nazi banners displayed proudly on buildings with the swastika. And I experienced discomfort most of all later on when I was asking myself why I wanted to write about this experience, how I would do it, and what I would say. And for a long time, I had no idea where the story was going. So lots of discomfort accompanied me from the very beginning when I got there, and the several trips I made to work with these teachers, and then when I got home and realized there was a story here worth telling, but I didn't know how I was going to do it. The one thing that guided me through all of the discomfort is a kind of faith in the process of composing, a belief that if I sit quietly for a long enough period of time, if I pause and pay attention to what is stirring in me, much as William Stafford reminds us in a book called Writing the Australian Crawl, where he talks about the importance of patience and receptivity whenever we're planning to write. If, in other words, I can become comfortable with my own discomfort, words will come. They may not always be the right words, but they'll be enough. They're a way to get started. So if we want to talk later about, how do you write? Generally, it's with that, I think for me, it's always that moment of getting quiet and pausing and waiting to see what will come next, and just trusting that something always will. During the years I worked on the book, and there were many years, and sometimes I had to put it aside for a while, but I always get drawn back to it, I struggled with a range of questions. Who were the perpetrators? Had I grown up in their time and lived their lives, had I been told the stories they were told, would I have been any different from them? And it's nice to say, well, I wouldn't have done what they did, but how does one know? I think so much of it is related to what we're told and the stories we sort of live into as we grow up. And the questions went on. What is it that shapes us as human beings? Is forgiveness possible? And how do we pay homage to the millions of lives that were lost? But in addition to those, which I think of as the big questions, I also had to come back and face my own fears. As I mentioned earlier, as a child and then as an adult, I embraced the prejudices of my parents. And although I had traveled throughout Europe, I adamantly refused to step foot in Germany or Austria. Even though my undergraduate major in college was art history, and I was expected to learn German in order to do graduate work, I refused to do so. Instead, I was so against Germany and Germans, I changed my major. I now look back at that and think, that's all I could do then. Now I wish, I could speak German, but I wouldn't go there. I just would not go there. So in other words, and I'll emphasize this one more time, I grew up turning away from anything German and held fiercely to the belief that if you peered beneath the surface of their stunning accomplishments in art, film, culture, and politics, you would find Nazis in disguise. All of these sentiments were roused as I walked on Austrian soil and taught in Austrian classrooms. I was often upset, struggling with sleepless nights, constantly assaulted by images. And so when writing time occurred in class, and like I think some of your teachers here perhaps as well, I often would write along with my students. So when the writing time happened, I found my fears. First I felt writer's block. I felt like I can't write about this. There's no way I can do this. But I also knew, again, I had no choice. So at some point, after struggling with whether I could say anything at all, I just decided to write and see what would come out. So here's what I wrote. What am I doing here in the homeland of Hitler's birth? Why have I come across an ocean to a land and a language I've never wanted to know? Never would I come here to the land where Nazis reigned, to the place where your people turned my people into objects of derision and hate. Like the numbers etched into their forearms, images are seared in my brain of bodies piled high in ditches, of hair and teeth piled high in corners. I see the laboratories, the wombs of young women filled with concrete, the bodies of babies flung aside, and the Mengele selection, the preference for twins. Oh, my twins. As I wrote those last words, I was stopped in my tracks. I am a mother of twins, and at the moment of writing, I was unable to go on. My impulse was to go get on a plane and go home. So instead, I stood up and stretched. This is ridiculous, I said to myself. You can't write about this. How could you ever read this to that room full of teachers? What do you think you're doing? So then I sat down, opened my journal, and tried to describe the struggle I was in. It is impossible for me to be here in Austria, I wrote, and not ask what happened. Jews were the play toys of the Germans, tortured, tormented, despised, destroyed. The bitterness runs deep, a well so deep it threatens to drown me. I want to know what happened here. This land of such overwhelming beauty, of such towering granite faces, peaks that dwarf any sense I have of human power. This land gave birth to Adolf Hitler. How does one understand that? What does it mean to have inherited the responsibility for this 20th century self-styled God goose-stepping his way to power? It was hard for me to face all that was unearthed by being in Austria. But I'd say now that it was writing about these issues that saved me from drowning in them. Writing gave me a perspective and a way to move on. Eventually, the teachers became my audience. And as hard as it was for them to hear what I was saying, they too had their own dragons to face. It was in dialogue about these issues, the past that haunted all of us in different ways, that we were able to make peace with at least some of them. I spent many years working on the book. Ultimately, I published it with the title On Austrian Soil, and it really was because standing on that soil was the first thing that struck me as this powerful sense of location. And it is, as Sean mentioned, what I think of often as a teaching memoir. But over the past decade, I also became interested in digital composing and ended up creating a digital story that recounts the journey I took in Austria using words, images, and music. So I'd like to close this portion of the session by playing the DVD. In it, you will see, first, at some point, you'll see a picture of me at about age 5, a photo, which is, that's the child. Then you'll see a photo of my parents soon after the end of the war, my father in his army uniform, and they are looking into each other's eyes in our driveway in Newark, New Jersey. You'll see a few of the Holocaust images that haunted me, and then more recent images of the Austrian teachers, both in the classroom and beyond. As you will see, one teacher stands out. Her name is Margaret Fessler, and she was a teacher in the class who, when she heard my poem and heard my concerns, she met them. She was as desperate to talk about the past as I was to sort of explore my own feelings. And she was unlike any of the other teachers. Most teachers would have preferred that we never went down this road, and they did not welcome an inquiry into the history or their parents or, you know, what had happened. But she kind of was the partner in this inquiry with me, and she pushed it really hard. So in the video, I interview her, and then you will hear her reciting a poem that she wrote in the voice of her unrepentant Nazi father-in-law. So she was married to a man whose father and mother were members of the Nazi Party before it was even legal to be in the Nazi Party in Austria. And her father-in-law never gave up his sense that it was a shame that they lost the war. And the way Austrians live often is they share a piece of property. So she and her husband and daughter live on one side of the house, and then there's a separation, and her in-laws live in the other side of the house. So she has to see them all the time. And for her, this was extraordinarily painful. So when I come along and I tiptoe into this question, she responds with, "We have to talk about this." So you'll hear her reading her poem. And that is what I want to say is what she wrote is what she needed to do when she faced her own dragon, which was the history and the memory and her in-laws. When it's finished, I'm sure there'll be some time for questions and comments and whatever else you want to talk about. So we're now going to try to show that. Ah.
In 1996, I traveled to Innsbruck to show Austrian teachers how Americans approach the teaching of writing and literature. As the plane descended, I was struck by the beauty of this land. The snow-capped mountains filled me with awe. But as soon as I set foot on Austrian soil, I was filled with foreboding. I knew that had I been a teacher in Innsbruck 60 years earlier, I would have been forced to wear the yellow star, marked as a loathsome enemy. Fit only for extermination. Born in America, I grew up feeling safe. But I was raised with the belief that although World War II had ended, the Germans' hatred of Jews had not. In my mind, Austrians were no different. Wasn't Hitler, after all, an Austrian? Wasn't he welcomed with open arms in the streets of Vienna? Standing on Austrian soil, I was haunted by images of the Holocaust, and I began to wonder how Austrian teachers, my prospective students, made sense of their past and that of their parents. Had they, too, been taught to hate the Jews? I did not know how to ask such questions. I could not bring myself to utter the words Jew or Holocaust in front of my students. But slowly, as we wrote together, we shaped an inquiry around these issues. Addressing the past was not easy. Some teachers responded in anger. One frankly stated, "When the last perpetrator dies, the world should bury the Holocaust with him." But not everyone felt this way. Margaret Fessler, it seemed, had been waiting her entire life to speak.
I have carried a lot of anger against the older generation, my parents' generation, because they were never willing to really confront their past, which for me means that you pass on the legacy to your children and your grandchildren.
Given the chance to write, though, most of the teachers found outlets in poetry and prose, some confronting, for the first time, the implications of their attitudes and their parents' actions. Margaret composed a poem in the voice of her unrepentant Nazi father-in-law, evoking the remorse he can never express.
We didn't mean to brand your arms. We didn't mean to rip off your clothes. We didn't mean to make you crawl on your knees. We didn't mean to select you on the ramp. We didn't mean to send you to the gas. We didn't mean to hurt anyone on our march to Norway. We didn't mean to load a cross on our offspring's shoulders. We didn't mean to cut off the human bond. We don't mean to say, forgive us. We were wrong the same.
I didn't know when I accepted the invitation to teach in Austria that it would become a life-altering event. I didn't know that writing would allow my students and me to confront the shame and suffering we had all inherited. I didn't know that listening to each other's stories would give us the courage to face the past rather than bury it. Dialogue of this sort is hard, but today, particularly in places where children are being taught to hate their neighbors, mustn't we find ways to see beyond our own frames of reference? Writing classrooms, I suggest, offer us a place to start. On Austrian Soil is one teacher's tale. It describes my journey from America to Austria and from the classroom to the world. It leads me to believe that writing teachers have a role to play in the creation of a just world, that in the place of hate, it is possible to create a pedagogy of hope.
Okay, you can. That's great. Great. Okay, done. Thank you. So that's a lot to take in. But if anyone wants to say something, respond, something strike you, I'm happy to answer questions.
There's a loose mic too that we could even,
You want this mic?
if we
Or
want
you-
to bring the mic to someone that has a question.
And do you want to introduce yourself too?
Hi, Sondra. I'm Barbara Krasner. I'm the one who emailed you. I just want to thank you for this book and having the courage to write this, because it gave me the courage to face my dragon, being the only Jew in a junior year abroad program 30 years after the war. So Christmas Eve, everyone in my dorm says, let's go to Christmas Mass. I say no. They ask why. I say I'm Jewish. Oh, I didn't know there were any left. And how do I respond to that? And now I teach in the English department, but I also teach in the history department, and I'm teaching the Holocaust. And I found that I was having a very different reaction to the readings than my students. So I'm writing about it. So I just want to thank you for that.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. It sounds like you being the other is a very hard place to be. And when we're young, we don't know what to do with it. But it sounds like you've found a way.
Thanks. I was just wondering, it sounded like you went over to Austria to do one thing, but this wasn't the thing that you thought you were going to do. Could you say a little bit about what you thought that course was going to be and how much it stayed the same and how much it changed?
Yeah, you can hear me, right? It's a really good question. I went over to teach 2 courses in a block, the teaching of literature and the teaching of writing. So I was wanting to show them research method, or writing, how we teach, why we teach the way we teach. So this is how it started. This is a good question. So there are a couple of readings that are important to me as an educator. And one is a book called A Letter to Teachers by a writer named Vito Perrone. And in it, and Perrone's, he's worked with teachers his whole life. He was in North Dakota. He'd done a lot of work. And this letter to teachers is a sort of a heartfelt letter about why he cares about teaching and what teaching is and how we need to create classrooms that embrace children, that work from strength, that give them, and that they're models of democracy. And he has a line in, really I think on the first page of the first chapter that says, "Education at its best is first and foremost a moral and an intellectual endeavor." So I asked the teachers to read this chapter, going to go to groups, talk about it. And to me, that's like so obvious, right? Education is based on a sense of morality, a sense of ethics, a sense of being honest and direct, and it's intellectually engaging, and we engage in questions and inquiries. And they got stopped on like day 2 of the session. They go, "Do you really believe this?" And I go, "Well, I do. Why? Do you have a problem with it?" And they said, "Yeah, we have a problem. We're taught here that we don't bring any personal opinions into the classroom at all. We are taught to be morally neutral. And we don't do this. This is not our way. We teach what we're told to teach, and it has nothing to do with making our students into good human beings. We just teach the content." So I let that sit for a little while, but I have to think about, what does that mean? And I also had them reading a very old piece by a woman named Louise Rosenblatt, who wrote a book called Literature as Exploration. So that was the literature piece. And in this, Rosenblatt says, teachers have to be real human beings in the classroom. You don't want to have this persona of you can, right? You can come in and, be whatever you want. And it doesn't mean you have to tell your students everything about your personal life, but you need to have some sense of authenticity of who you are and what you believe. And if you're responding to literature, you respond with what you feel or think or whatever. So when I was writing so now I'm in the writing class, I'm writing my poem. I don't know what I'm going to do with this, but I keep thinking, if I'm a real human being in this classroom, I can't hide my questions. I didn't expect to think about the Holocaust when I went, and I'm telling you, before I went, I pretended I was going to Paris. Like, I was so freaked out by going to Austria. I didn't even want to know where I was going. And why did I go? Because my twins were young. I also have a daughter. I hadn't traveled in many years, and I thought, oh, great, I'm going to go do what I love to do, travel and teach, and I just didn't want to face where I was going. Then when I get there, I can't help it. So I'm holding these 2 things. If I'm going to be true to the theories I believe in, I have to share what's going on with me. I can't pretend this isn't this is like, and how do I explain my writer's block? And I couldn't write some fake little story. I mean, if I believe that you have to be honest and direct and real, and I'm dealing with adults. I'm not teaching high school kids. I'm teaching teachers who've been in the classroom. They know classrooms can get complicated. So I decided the first step was just to read my poem to my small group. Margaret was in that group. She encouraged me. She said when she heard the poem, she goes, "We never talk about our history, and we must." So all I did was ask some questions about, if you're interested, I'd love to know more. It's not a classroom. I'd just love to know more about your history. Nobody wanted to say anything. So if that has been the only 2 classes, this book wouldn't have been written, and it wouldn't have happened. What happened is they needed someone to come back and teach them classroom research. And they lobbied strongly for me to come back. And I had to think about it, go back again, but I realized I'd like to teach classroom research. And if you teach the classroom research course, you also become their mentor for the thesis. So now I'm going to be going back for 3 more courses, which means I'm going to have an extended time with them. And again, nothing might have happened except that I won an award in 1996 from the Carnegie Foundation as a professor award. And I was asked to give a talk at the Graduate Center in probably '96. And what am I going to talk about? And I realized this teaching story, just the first class, meeting Margaret, these questions, writing about them, and the notion of moral neutrality. Like, if you may or may not know this, but Switzerland called itself morally neutral during World War II. And what it was a pathway for all the gold that the Germans took out of the teeth of the Jews and all the banks they robbed, and they passed the gold, it's called the gold train, through Switzerland on its way to banks in Portugal. So I wasn't real happy about moral neutrality as a stance. And I think we all know you have to take a stand, right? You have to stand up when something is, when human rights are being abused. So I give this talk, and I do that, and it's written down. And I agree to go back and teach them classroom research. Now, here's the dilemma. I just wrote about them as the students in my classroom. They are technically the subjects in my research. And if I'm teaching them classroom research, don't I have to show them what I wrote about them? I mean, I didn't have to, but we're reading all these other pieces of classroom research, and they're all going to design little projects, in their classroom so they can get their master's degrees. So I'm really nervous about it. I first brought the paper just to show Margaret, and then she says, you have to show them, you have to show them. And I go, no, I don't have to show them. And she goes, you have to show them. And I go, no, I don't have to show them. But I knew she was right. So while we're studying classroom research, and they're trying to come up with questions that they want to study around their students' writing and learning and teaching, I say one night, okay, I'm going to show you something I wrote, and it's about you. And if I publish it, I'd like your permission to use, to publish it with your names. And in it, I wrote many of the things that I read to you, that I thought, if you scratch a German, you'll find a Nazi. But these were old. This is when I was 13, but I give them the paper, and they read it, and I tell them I would prefer not to talk about it. They should write to me, and I'll write back. But they couldn't, they had to talk about it. And the range went from, how dare you come here and do this? This is not professional. You came here with your personal problems. I'm like, okay. And others who were saying, I've never thought about it from the point of view of a Jewish person. I've never met a Jew before in my life. My whole family has hidden this history. We still don't know what my father did, but we know he was a Nazi. Thank you for opening up these questions. So there was a large range of opinion, but that became another chapter in that book. And over time, the people who were angry at me wrote, and then I would spend a lot of time writing back. And first trying to hear what they were saying, and secondly trying to build, I wasn't calling them. One woman wrote, she was so upset with me. This is in reflection. She was so upset that she realized why weeks later, because she felt she wouldn't have been smart enough to see through the propaganda, and she wouldn't have been brave enough. And so her anger wasn't really at me. It was at her own fear and her own upset with her own father and her own family. And she wrote, how could loving fathers and good grandparents be Nazis? And then she said, I finally figured it out. They split themselves in two. And they could be a loving father at home, and you could be a murderer of many, many people in another situation. So that was her dragon. So over time, each person I dealt with, who's in that course, came to grips. But it was a classroom research course. By the third trip, we were just going over their theses, and by now we were really close. We had gone through this, and I should also say that Margaret, of course, has a friend who's a historian who offered to take us on a walking tour of Innsbruck and describe to us what happened during the Holocaust in Innsbruck. I'm like, there's somebody who knows this? And I said it has to be optional. Teachers don't have to come. But in Austria, if the professor's doing something, the students they're going to come. So this is a great story. This is in the second course. It was during a February, like our winter break kind of thing. It was during February, and I was there for a couple weeks. We'd had gorgeous weather the entire course, and you could go outside without your jacket. It was warm. And the day of the walking tour, which they didn't have to come on, but they said they would, the weather turned. And we had this horrendous storm and winds and snow, and we're freezing. And the weather was like, it was like this amazing, so the weather sort of representing or somehow mirroring our own distress. And this man, Horst Schreiber, took us to these various places in Innsbruck where Jews had been rounded up, where there had been a synagogue burned, where people were murdered on Kristallnacht. And each of these things was new to the teachers. So it was an out-of-class field trip of sorts, but they, again, had their own dragons. The women, when he talked about the complicity of the Catholic Church, that the bishops were totally willing to support Hitler and turn their eyes away from what was happening, the women who were devout Christians and Catholics were beside themselves. So it led to more conversation, and I think there were some blurring of boundaries, but everyone ended up with a research topic. Everyone had a thesis to do, and then my next trip was to go over their theses. And I'll just tell you that the classroom, and again, they couldn't have been more grateful, and I guess the testament to this thing of crossing these boundaries was they're all still my friends today. And I have to, so when they graduate from this program, they come to City College for graduation. And graduation at City College is like, it's amazing. There's balloons and bands and little kids and, you know, everybody's thrilled. And the Austrian graduations are like you stand like this and you get your diploma and you go, Dankeschön, you know. So they're like blown away. And I have everyone to my house for a barbecue. So there's, you know, a celebratory thing. So there was a kind of real sense that we had traveled somewhere together. And then when the book came out, which wasn't then, it took several more years, I did a reading, they all came. I mean, it's continued to be a live thing. There's one other piece I was going to tell you about. Oh, yeah. In the third trip, before I come, and now Margaret and I are closer and closer, she says, would you like to meet my in-laws? So I'm like, oh God, do I want, you know, what am I supposed to do? So part of me says, no, I don't want to meet those Nazis. You know, like no. Like I'm a Jewish person, I should say no, because you're bad and I shouldn't ever talk to you. And the part of me that believes in dialogue and believes that what we need to do in this world is be able to talk to people we were taught to hate, that's an ethical act, said to myself, you can't espouse dialogue in the classroom and then refuse to engage in it when you leave the safety of those four walls. So I said, okay. So by the third trip, I actually have dinner with Margaret's in-laws. And that's a whole other story. But so did I give you a long answer to your? It didn't start out like anything I expected, but we did get the work done. They did get their MAs. And along the line, we did a lot. So just introduce yourself.
My name is Janina. I'm actually a graduate student here at the university. And I have a quick question. So you said at your first trip, the teachers had this idea of moral neutrality. I'm curious of what their perspective was by the end of your time together with them.
That's a great question. I think there was one teacher, a man in the course, who was clear from the beginning. He said, I'm here to get my MA degree. And he was in a business department. You know, I want my students to be able to succeed on the job market, and that's it. And he never changed. You know, he was clear what he wanted, and he felt justified, and he went on to have a good life, and he didn't change. Most of the others, over the course, I mean, again, there's letters in the book and other letters I received said these things that I quoted earlier. I would never have thought like this. And one woman, a very devout woman, who taught in an all-girls Catholic school, private school. First of all, she started teaching the stories of survivors to her girls in their literature classes. This huge change, because when they would teach about the Holocaust, what they would teach are the names and the dates of the battles and the numbers of people who were sent, you know, who were in the concentration camps. They didn't, unless they were really searching, they didn't know the narratives like Elie Wiesel's Night, you know, or Primo Levi's, you know, Survival in Auschwitz. They didn't know them. So they didn't teach them. But she started teaching, so they were reading the stories of survivors, which was really powerful, and recognizing that they had to take a stand on things. And that, I'd say many of them began to have this be a piece. Did they change dramatically? I guess to whatever degree they could. But their teaching changed, and I think in the end that was what I cared about. It's a good question.
Hi, my name is Gadi Galinsky. I'm actually a transfer student from Israel.
Oh, wow.
And my first question goes to, did you feel kind of redemption at the end of the process? Which it comes back from a book that I read a few years ago about Avrum Burg. I don't know if you know, he was a member of parliament in Israel. And he wrote a book about when only Israel would overcome Hitler, then we can deal with the Palestinian in a way which is kind of more naturally or more. This is the first question. Second, what you can tell me about the way that Holocaust is being taught in Austria? I know that in Germany, they copied the way that Israel does it. So if you can give your experience, I would.
Okay. I mean,
Thank you.
redemption, I'm not, I mean, I did change radically as a result of this. So I no longer see Austrians and Germans as my enemies. In fact, that many of them are my dear friends.
We mean kind of you as a Jew come on Austrian soil after all this and all those emotions that you've been through, and you're teaching courses to people that you know that their parents wanted to exterminate your culture. So that's what I meant.
Well, I definitely felt and do feel that the sins of the parents do not necessarily become the responsibility, or it's not the sin of the child. So wherever the perpetrators are, I don't have to deal with, I don't deal with them. And I say this when I give longer talks on the book, that I stand here as someone who didn't lose anyone in the Holocaust. So yes, I had this instilled in me, but I do not have the experience of Holocaust survivors or their children or their grandchildren. So I think the questions for them are very different. They're much closer to the trauma. And I also think and then I would ask, what gives me the right then to take this on? I didn't lose anyone. You know, I was very assimilated Jew. We did not practice Judaism. We did, we had holidays, but it wasn't like I was an observant Jew. So what's my right? And I was helped to take this on by a quote from an academic named Terence Dupre, who actually committed suicide in 1987, I believe. And he writes something like, "The Holocaust is a sounding board for all of us now living, and it haunts us, it stays in the mind of all of us now living, we, the inheritors." And I think he authorizes people to say, if you're a human being, this is a legacy you can take on in whatever way you can. So I wanted to say that for where we locate ourselves in any stance, it has to do with who we are and our history. So again, I wouldn't speak for survivors or their children or how they would feel talking about this. But for me, making friends with Margaret and finding someone who was like a soul sister in this other part of the world helped me let go of what I felt about the Holocaust, which was a real sense of betrayal by the world. And I really changed. I used to feel betrayed by America, betrayed by the world, betrayed by humankind, betrayed by whatever concept of God one has. It was like none of that. Because if this could happen to people that I identify with, I just felt betrayed. And having made friends and having written about it and having wrestled with questions of what it means to move forward, it changed. So I just don't carry it in any way. But I will say, my current work today is as director of something called the Holocaust Educators Network. It's founded by a non-for-profit in New York City. We bring 25 teachers every summer to New York City to study Holocaust, genocide, and social justice. And almost all the teachers who come to us are not Jewish. And so there is a kind of a mission about, a question about what does it mean to teach about genocide and what is the point? And where Israel fits in that is complicated. Has Israel made peace with Hitler so it can make peace with the Palestinians? I don't know.
No,
it's another story.
But about the second question, about
teaching
the Holocaust in Austria?
Very poorly when it's taught. So I know that there's lots of connections between German teachers and Yad Vashem, and lots of exchange, and I think there's an intelligent way of going about it. In Austria, it's haphazard. And they take kids to Mauthausen. The images of the concentration camp in the video were from Mauthausen, which is Margaret. I end the book close to the end with Margaret and me visiting Mauthausen together as a Christian and a Jew, Austrian and American, and we walk through this camp, which is horrendous, together. They take their kids to these concentration camps and they giggle because they're so embarrassed and ashamed and they don't know what to do with their emotions. So I would say teaching about the Holocaust requires great sense of compassion and what it is that's so traumatic, because you just expose kids to a bunch of atrocities and they don't know, they're traumatized and they don't know what to do with their trauma. So I think it's not taught well. And I think the missing link, of course, is that they don't get to write about it. It's a longer story, but it's a real argument about where is the place in our lives, in our hearts, for writing about, our dragons, what scares us, what is hard. And if you can do that, you can take a step forward. So that's what we teach in our summer. Does that answer a little? A little.
So Ian Marshall, I'm a faculty member in the English department. So I'm just wondering if you see any parallels between that experience, that moment, and our contemporary world. I mean, I think that there are some who would see the U.S. as a kind of version of Nazi Germany, except it's never really had to confront a kind of military defeat that forced it to sort of confront its guilt, and that racialized others might well be in a kind of version of a kind of Austria, except it's more like that businessman who was okay to just sort of, it's in the past, let's leave it there,
Mm-hmm.
even though there are those who might not feel quite the same way. And if you see parallels, how do you speak to students who are racialized others, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would love to say, does anyone else want to also try to think about this? It's a huge question. And you're not talking just in the current administration. You're talking historically and the way America is a colonial empire. I don't have a good answer. This won't resolve it for you, but our program today, the teachers who come to us, if they're talented and have leadership ability, we fund them to teach 5-day programs in their own states. So for instance, we have a program in Montana that looks at the Native American genocide and the Holocaust. It's a perfect example of a people in our country who were demolished and whose families were destroyed and who were all of that. We have a program that in Atlanta that deals with eugenics, because eugenics happened a lot in the South, and the whole African American issue. We're doing one now actually in New Jersey at Brookfield this summer that will look at how we other people. So we attempt, at least in our programs, to get teachers to make these connections in terms of United States policy and racism, and now, of course, all of the, Islamophobia. I mean, we look to have the teachers grapple with this in a sufficient enough way that they can then bring it back to their students and they can try to figure out what are the parallels. It's not the same. Can't be, the signposts are not necessarily the same, but they're getting closer and closer. So we have a survivor who talks about be aware of the signposts on the way to Auschwitz. And they're getting closer. It's scary.
I think I'm next.
Okay.
My name is Leo Paris-Condola. I'm the English faculty here at William Patterson. I also have been to both Austria and Germany, but for wildly unrelated reasons that your talk today. Actually, Ina and I were in Germany many years ago. I don't remember how long ago, for a conference. And I was in Austria. There was one of several other countries to which I traveled by bicycle on vacation. So, but my question is unrelated to those issues. I wanted to talk about something, if I remember correctly, please correct me if I'm wrong. Dictum was authored by Donald Murray, to the effect of, how do I know what I mean until I see what I say? Which I thought was very confusing when I first met it, and which I have since tried to adopt as a teaching strategy in my own courses. And what that's really what I want to ask about. What I do in my classes is to imbue in students the concept of writing the wrong word.
Mm-hmm.
And the wrong word will eventually, if you're serious enough about what you're doing, will lead you into another direction, perhaps not the direction you started out on, but eventually get around to saying something substantive.
Well, I certainly, as you know, think that the only way, that writing is a process of discovery. I think that's partly what you're saying. And we don't know what we think until we actually try to find the language to say it. And so if you can't say it exactly, what for me, is, as you know, is always interesting is, well, how do you know it's not the right word? What tells you? Just try it. But if you know it's not the right word, what's telling you that isn't the right word? Isn't it like an intuition in your body? Like a kind of, like you get tight, it doesn't feel right.
Like something irks you.
Yeah, something hurts you, right? Yeah. So there's a philosopher who would talk about how words are very personal. And we don't always know what we mean until we try that word. And you can sit there and go, And it's not, is it right, did I spell it right? Or is it right, do I have a comma? No, it's, does that word capture what I'm trying to say? And when it does, there's ultimately this feeling of, yeah, that feels okay, I'm going to keep going in this direction. And when it doesn't, you can still go, but sometimes you can stop and go, well, okay, if that's not exactly the right word, then what would be closer to what I'm trying to say? And so there's this little dance that can happen between your inner knowing and your page. And that, to me, is what's really interesting about the writing process, because it's endless. It can happen all the time. We're always searching for words. So I think whether you have hit on, it's the wrong word, but it's okay, you accept it to keep going. But it's really good to double back and say, now, does that hit my ear right or wrong? Is there some, and if it really doesn't feel good, okay, breathe. Like, William Stafford says, be receptive, be patient. And if you're allowing more, the discourse, the meaning will continue to create itself. It's just believing you can do that. And everyone can do that. Maybe that's a good place to stop. Is it?
Please join me in thanking